Hello, everyone, and welcome to this pre-recorded message in advance of the next Subject Architect Forum, which is due to take place on Monday, the 20th of January. So like I said, this is a pre-recorded message in advance of the meeting in order to share with you some of the research and the theory that the next couple of Subject Architect Forums will be drawing on, particularly in relation to Key Stage 3 assessment, which is a CPD focus for all the schools across the Trust, and it closely aligns with the Trust project on the Key Stage 3 assessment model. We're going to start with just thinking about where we got to at the end of the last session and what we agreed would be happening in the next couple of sessions. So towards the end of the last Subject Architect, we agreed that over the course of the next two sessions, we'll be considering both the mechanisms and the of formative assessment and the principles of formative and summative assessment. So if you think about if we break that down in terms of what that actually means, so the principles is what is actually going to be assessed, and mechanisms are the strategies and the tools that are used both formatively and summatively to try and assess. So that's what the next couple of sessions will be focusing on. And a reminder of what we agreed would be the aims of the Architect Forums, as well as the focuses. So if I start with the focuses on Monday, the 20th of Jan, we agreed that we will be looking at summative assessment, particularly Year 7 and Year 8, and marking criteria. And on the 17th of March, we'll be looking at formative assessment. Now, part of the reason we've done this pre-recorded message is so we can share the theory and the research with you, so that actually within the actual session, you have much more time to do or to fulfill the aims of the Subject Architect Forums, which are to analyse and evaluate the current practice. So look at sharing your summative assessments with each other and having a chance to discuss them and to analyse them. To share best practice, to think about how the research and the theory that I'm going to share with you now fits with your current practice, and to overcome any common difficulties through collaboration, but also by drawing on that research and discussing it in a subject-specific forum. So that's really what we agreed at the end of last session, going forwards for at least the next couple. Before we start, or before I go through some of the research specific to summative assessment, I wanted to share with you the evidence that these sessions are drawing on, and that particularly the content of this recording is drawing on. And you won't be surprised to know that it's the same evidence on which the flow policy is based on. So both the meta-analyses and the more practitioner research that the flow policy draws on. And it's research that we are very familiar with, that is used very commonly across our trust, and that really informs the responsive teaching route or the responsive teaching aspect of the flow policy. So this is some of the research, and then these are some of the practitioner articles or books that we will be drawing on. And in particular, I wanted to focus on the fact that in this recording, I'll be drawing heavily on the work of Dylan William and also on the work of Daisy Christodoulou. But there are others that align with their theories and their principles that you will be familiar with, and that will therefore, hopefully some of this will resonate with you. Okay, so before, as a quick reminder of key terminology, we did this at the end of the last session, but just making sure that we're happy with what the difference is between curriculum and assessment and how they're linked. So a curriculum is the substance of what's taught, and the plan to which it's taught, and how it's taught. Assessment are the mechanisms that you use to basically measure the extent to which children have made progress against that curriculum plan that you've set out. So the two are inextricably linked. You can't do assessment without curriculum. You can't really do curriculum without assessment. The other key definition that we need to make sure that we remember is the difference between formative and summative. So formative is true responsive teaching. It's the mechanisms that you use to measure to what the extent to which children have made have met learning intentions in a short cycle, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in every lesson over a sequence of lessons. It could be a little bit longer. But the purpose of it is so that it provides both the children and the teacher with feedback, and it allows change. So formative assessment is all about being a recipe for future action, as Dylan William would talk about or would say. And that's change either in the child's application or in the teacher's delivery, and how the curriculum is delivered there from there on. Summative then is slightly different. Summative measures attainment in most cases, not necessarily progress. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it's attainment. Some formative can be used as summative, but it measures attainment at specific points in the curriculum Sometimes it's at the very end, sometimes it's at assessment points in the middle of that curriculum's delivery. But these are often not used for the purpose of change. They're often used to determine attainment and determine how well children have done, not are doing. And that's why they're often marked using a criteria, using numbers, using grades, and so on and so forth. So that's that's just a reminder of the difference. I'm sure we're very aware of it, but it's important to have that difference clear in our mind. So when we think about summative assessment at Key Stage 3 and where we start, I think a good place to start would be the link between curriculum and assessment. And I said earlier, you can't really do assessment without curriculum, and you can't do curriculum without assessment. So the two are inextricably linked. Particular Key Stage 3, what we are thinking about here is when we are designing our summative assessment or our assessment model, we've got to think about the curriculum, both its intent and implementation, so the plan and the delivery. Basically, the curriculum in any given subject is the progression model. So that is what we've really got to remember at Key Stage 3. Okay, the curriculum provides you with the progression model, and I'll unpick that a little bit in a moment. Okay, so if we think about what that means, then, okay, when we are building formative and summative assessments into it, you are measuring the extent to which students have made progress against the curriculum that you've designed that has progress built into it. Okay, so the idea is that as children learn your curriculum, they get better at your subject, and the assessment that you choose to apply at different points is testing whether they are making the right progress along that journey. So are they keeping up with the steps? Are they moving along that racetrack at a steady, at the correct speed? Whatever analogy you want to use, but that's effectively what we're looking at, okay? And any curriculum that is designed at Key Stage 3 has to have progress built into it, okay? So that fits in with the last point I want to make, that the design of the curriculum must have progression into it, built into it. So that's why the two are very inextricably linked. If we're thinking then about, well, what does progress mean? Okay, what are we talking about? So if we're saying, you know, it has to have progression built into it, children have to make progress, what are we talking about? And often, when we talk about progress, we are talking about learning. Okay, so that's the business in which we're in. That's the business in which children should be in. So actually, when we are, you know, delivering a curriculum, we're intending for children to learn something. And it'd be helpful to stop here and just think about a definition of learning. Now, there's lots of definitions I could have given you. The one I want to share with you is one from Ofsted. It's by no means the best, but it correlates with a lot of other definitions from research that basically suggests that learning, the word learning or progress, is an alteration in a child's long-term memory, or an alteration in anyone's long-term memory. If nothing's been altered, nothing's been learned. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about mastery. We're talking about something being mastered so that it can be done automatically without necessarily thinking about it. Okay, so if we're thinking about then progress and what are we trying to measure, we're thinking about learning, we're thinking about, are students able to know more, remember more, and do more? Okay, so know more and remember more is your content knowledge. Do they know more stuff? Okay, and is it harder as they get along? Is it building? And can they do more? Are the skills that they're learning getting more and more complex over time? Okay, so that is really what we need to be building into our curriculum. And your Key Stage 3 curriculum when you design it, has to have those things built into it, but it also needs to give children the opportunity to retrieve their learning, to apply it in different contexts so that it becomes malleable enough so that actually they build that schema in their long-term memory so that they can demonstrate that they can apply that learning over long periods of time, okay? That's what the GCSE requires children to do, okay? That's why it's so difficult. They've got 2 years to learn a body of knowledge and some skills that get assessed in a linear fashion at the end of the GCSE. And that's what we're trying to build in to our Key Stage 4 curriculum. And that's the same principle applies at Key Stage 3. Okay, the idea that actually we should be building progression into it, we should be building learning into it so that children build knowledge and skills into their long-term memory. So we know then that these are the principles that should be guiding our curriculum. So then how do we then measure whether children are making progress? Okay, so I said at the beginning, when we're measuring progress, we're thinking about, are the children moving along that learning journey? But not just are they moving along it, are they moving along it at the right pace? Are they going in the right direction? Are they going at the right speed? Whatever analogy you want to use, okay? And are they going where you want them to go as quickly as you want them to go, okay? And that's what we're doing when we're assessing. We are measuring that, okay? Now, one way of measuring that, particularly at Key Stage 3, is by deciding in advance what are your progress indicators going to look like, okay, at each stage of your learning journey. So breaking your curriculum down, often year by year or by half term by half term, and deciding at each point of that curriculum journey, what is it that you expect them to have mastered at that point, and then ensuring that you are testing them at that point and before you're moving on to the next bit, okay? Now, you could take that analogy even further and think about the fact that you could be doing that in every lesson, and I'll share something with you that shows that. But really, we're thinking about progress indicators. At each point, what's that marker that you want them to reach to show you that they're on track, okay? And if we think about those progress indicators, what are we looking for? What do you want them to know and remember more and be able to do more at each stage and overall, because that's your summative assessment. Now, that's a lot of words. And if we're thinking about trying to create something visual that will help us remember that, I always find this model from Dylan Wiliam really helpful. So Dylan Wiliam talks a lot about assessment. He's an expert. And he talks about assessment being in cycles when we're teaching. And actually, I've kind of adapted his model and thought about curriculum being in cycles as well, and then mapped the assessment idea against it. So if we start with a rubric like this, and we think about short-term, medium-term, and long-term cycle, if we start with this idea of curriculum, so the first kind of row is about curriculum. On the right-hand side, we've got long-term cycle of a curriculum. So that's your overall curriculum. That's your intent. That's your master plan. That's the overall, by the end, I want them to be able to know this, remember this, and do this, okay? The knowledge and the skills. Now, this might be, you might have this in various forms in your department. You might have this as a roadmap. You might have this as a kind of like a printed document or a colored document or whatever. You might get the children to stick it into their book. It doesn't really matter, as long as you have something that shows that you have a long-term view of your curriculum and how it all fits together at Key Stage 3. And then we break it down, and we move from the intent to the implementation, and we think about the medium and the short-term cycle. And this is the real, how you deliver the curriculum. So in the medium-term cycle, we're talking about units of learning or medium-term plans. We're talking about learning objectives and outcomes for medium periods of time, overarching questions and themes, okay, of both knowledge and skills that you want them to master. And then we break, and from that emerge your short-term cycle lessons, lesson by lesson, those learning objectives and outcomes for each lesson, but always feeding into that long-term cycle. So the three kind of emerge from each other. Now, once you've got your curriculum set out like this, then your assessment model emerges from it. And this is where Dylan Wiliam talks about short-term, medium-term, long-term assessment. So in your short term, in your lessons, this is your checking progress against your learning objectives and outcomes for individual lessons. So what is it you want them to learn by the end of that lesson, either knowledge or skills, and what are the little mechanisms you're building in throughout the course of the lesson to check that? So your mini whiteboards, your exit tickets, your question and answers, your circulating around the room. This is true responsive teaching. You spot something that's not working, you either adjust there and then, or stop the class, reteach, do whatever to try and get the children to make that little bit of progress along that short period of that learning journey, which is your lesson. So you do that every day. And then in your medium term cycle, you're looking at your unit of learning as a whole and thinking about, okay, how am I going to just check that, yes, they can do these things in terms of short term, but actually what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure that they've embedded this knowledge over the long term, over the medium term, and then in long term. So this is where you might build in your retrieval practice or more extended answer questions, or even a mini end of unit test that's still low stakes because it's not summative, but allows you to see how much of this are they retaining in their long-term memory. Okay, and you might be sampling at this stage, or you might set them something on everything they've done for that unit. Now, when we get to the long-term cycle, this is what we're talking about in terms of true summative assessment. So you're checking here progress, and often you're checking attainment, okay, at the end of a particular cycle, and that be, at a particular data drop point or assessment point, or end of the year, or end of the key stage, okay? And these assessments tend to sample knowledge and skills because you can't assess everything, and they sample in relation to what is imperative that children understand and know in your curriculum, and how much of the curriculum time you've dedicated to it, okay? So that's just a really helpful way of thinking about how does curriculum and assessment fit together, and how should I be thinking about planning my formative and summative assessment in my curriculum. Now, if we take summative assessment in a bit more detail and think about, okay, so I want to design a summative assessment for Key Stage 3. Where do I start? What do I include in it? I've been told I've got to assess twice a year, once in April, once in June. Well, what do I include in my summative assessment? And one way of kind of getting around that is by having a model that you can draw ideas from and that you can use as a basis for your summative assessment planning. And this is an example of a model. So if we go back to what I was saying earlier about the key progression indicators in your curriculum and knowing what they are at the end of each big stage of your curriculum, then now that could be at the end of every term in every year group, okay? So we take year 7, you've got a curriculum for year 7, you roughly teach it either by term or half term. What are your key progression indicators at the end of those sections, and that will then give you a basis of then what you include in your summative assessment. Now, I've broken it down here into substantive knowledge and disciplinary knowledge. Sometimes substantive knowledge can be referred to as procedural knowledge, but basically we're talking about content, know and remember, okay? And then disciplinary knowledge is, in a nutshell, skills. So if you're able to do that and break that down and really pull out your progress indicators, that by the end of every section, they need to be able to do the following skill to this extent. They need to be able to define the following words. They must understand the following concepts and be able to explain them. Then if you're able to do that for every term, even by half term, but for every year in your Key Stage 3, when you are then trying to put together a summative assessment at any point in the Key Stage 3 journey, you have here a template which you can draw on, and that can guide you in terms of your sampling, okay, of the domain. And what I mean by that is no summative assessment can assess everything you've taught. It's impossible. So what you're always going to do is sample. So here is a rubric that you can use to say, actually, this particular bit of content knowledge is really important. It appears 3 times. Okay, they need to have learnt this and mastered it. I have to assess this in my summative assessment. in terms of like the skills that you want to include, this will give you an idea of the progression that children will be making in your curriculum for skills. And that will give you a really good idea of, okay, of like in year 7, I can only assess the skill up to this extent. In year 8, I can do it a little bit more. In year 9, I can do it a bit more. Okay. And having something like this will really help you. Now, in many ways, I would say this probably replaces the old Key Stage 3 level descriptors or any sort of level descriptors or grade descriptors that we have in our schools, because this is much more objective. It's much clearer, and it will really help you design that summative assessment. Now, you may not have anything like this in your school, and that's not a problem, but this is just a way of thinking about how do I decide what goes in my summative assessment. Now, before I finish off, I just wanted to share with you some of the research that Daisy Christodoulou's done on summative assessment and how to construct an effective one. Now, the first thing to say, she actually says that devising an effective summative assessment is really quite hard because of all the things I've said about the fact that you're sampling. And when they spend a long time at Key Stage 4 and 5 designing those assessments, because they're difficult. It's difficult to get the right balance, the right measure, and make it fair. And you will be doing that at Key Stage 3. And not only is it difficult, but you'll be doing it on your own often because you'll be teaching a curriculum that's slightly different to another school's curriculum, particularly if you're an option subject or a non-core subject. So it's important to have some guiding principles and a rubric that you can go to try and help you design your assessment. So just to finish off, I'm just going to share with you a couple of principles from Christodoulou, both in terms of designing your assessment and in terms of creating that marking criteria. And just to say, she's not the only one that talks about this. Several other people have discussed summative assessment. So Alan Boxer, for example, has a whole chapter of it in his book. But these are, the same guiding principles apply. So Christodoulou talks about the fact that actually your summative assessment should contain elements of the substantive knowledge you've taught or the procedural knowledge you've taught. It should sample it, but it should be in accordance to how much it's been taught and in what depth it's been taught in your curriculum. It's really important that you assess what has been taught, not you assess what you think children should be, or what, assess a kind of random thing. You need to really make sure that your assessment is aligned with the content that children have been taught and the extent to which it has been taught. It wouldn't be fair to give them questions on something that they've not been taught or is harder than they've been taught. She talks about the fact that the domain must be large enough for it to be meaningful, but also not so large that the questions makes it difficult to create questions, and not so narrow that it makes it too hard. Along the same vein, she talks about the fact that actually we should be including or assessing disciplinary knowledge that is in line with the extent to which you've taught it in your curriculum. And that's why having that model over the course of the 3 years is really important. And then taking into consideration the level and depth to which all these things have been mastered, the difficulty and complexity of the skills, the time you've spent on it in the curriculum. If you spent 1 lesson on a particular skill, but you've spent 7 lessons on another, it wouldn't be fair to spend a greater proportion of the assessment on that skill that you've spent 1 lesson on, as an example. Okay, it seems obvious and logical, but it's important to bear in mind. So that's a kind of guidance in terms of creating your assessment. In terms of creating a markings criteria or trying to mark or trying to create descriptors to try and mark your assessment, she talks about the fact that the overall assessment needs to contain enough marks so that you're able to distinguish children. Now, this is particularly important for us as a trust, because if we're moving to a quintile system, we need to be able to rank children, and then we need to be able to group them into their quintiles. Now, we can only do that if there's a big range of marks, and to do that, you have to have a large enough assessment. So, anything between 40, 50, 60 marks would be a big range of marks, okay? Another guiding principle is making sure that you have marks awarded in proportion of the complexity of each of the questions. So harder questions get more marks, more complex skills get more marks. Making sure that you've got a range of marks built into the assessment, that you scaffold the knowledge and skills, and that there's marks are scaffolded just like they are at GCSE. For a couple of reasons, making sure that it's accessible for all and it stretches those most able. So it's an all-encompassing assessment, particularly at Key Stage 3, where we're not setting and we're not tiering. Okay. So those are just some guiding principles for devising an effective summative assessment. There's plenty of others, but these are just some of the ones that as a trust we're trying to work towards. And that's some of the theory on assessment. So enjoy discussing that in your subject architect forums. And please do, if there are any questions, please do make a note of them and talk to your subject architect about them or their teaching and learning link. Many thanks.